Next, from Chicago, Jack Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to the USSR from 1987 to 1991, gives an address at the Union League Club of Chicago titled Russia Under Putin, How to Work with Him. This runs about 50 minutes.
The question before us that I was asked to talk about is Russia under Putin, how to work with it. You know, looking out at the recent developments, and particularly a lot of the rhetoric over the last 3 or 4 years, one would almost think that we're back in a Cold War. Except this time it's not a Cold War with the Soviet Union, a great communist empire, but with the Russian Federation. The rhetoric going back and forth, the condemnations back and forth, and even, I would say, the requirements that the leaders on both sides are now pressing for more military confrontation is very reminiscent of the Cold War. However, when you really think about it, the issues are quite different. After all, the Cold War was fundamentally about ideology, about the communism and the attempt of the Soviet Union, in effect, to spread communism in the world, which was sort of the original intent of the victors in the Bolshevik Revolution. And, of course, the geopolitical competition that developed from that, then the military competition, and then the absolutely insane nuclear arms race. We reached a point during that nuclear arms race when I think some calculated that each side had enough nuclear weapons, if they were used, to destroy not just each other, but civilization on Earth, and maybe certainly humanity on Earth, not once, not twice, but 7 times over. And, you know, I would think at the time, you know, once you've done it once, why do you want to do it more than that? But of course, the reason we gave was not how much we could destroy, but the fear that the other side, if they thought they had an advantage, might attack us. Now, we were able, actually, thinking back, over a relatively few years since in the late 80s, to end that arms race and to get the level of arms way down. In fact, at least during the Reagan administration, dealing with Gorbachev, our 2 leaders actually had a goal of ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons, which is a goal we need, I think, to revive. So the present confrontation is nowhere like that. But the difficulty is it could become that again, because in all of the things we've been talking about and are talking about today, differences over Ukraine, differences over Syria, what we're not talking about is the nuclear arsenals that both our countries have. And that is, you might say, the elephant in the room, which we're ignoring. Okay, you know, thinking back, before we think about what we can do to deal with Russia under the current president, Vladimir Putin, we ought to give some thought to how we got to where we are now. You know, there is a traditional Russian, I would say almost habit, going back to the middle of the 19th century, that when conditions are bad, you ask 2 questions. One is, "Kto vinovat?" Who's to blame? And the other is, "Что делать?" What are we supposed to do? What to do? And I think that, first of all, let's think about "Kto vinovat?" Who is responsible? And I would say that if you want to know what has produced the current policies that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is carrying out, which are very popular in Russia, this is something we must not forget, is something that both sides contributed to. Who is responsible for the current relationship? The United States and the Russian government. We bear mutual responsibility. just as earlier, the end of the Cold War ended when we finally were able to cooperate with the leader of the Soviet Union toward the common end of ending the insanity of the arms race. This time, we seem to be at cross purposes in a number of areas. And I would say that, in thinking about this and who is responsible and of the actions of both, I'm reminded of a story that one of the Russian politicians in the 1990s used to say about Russian economic reform. He said it reminded him of the story of two Russian bear hunters that every year would go up in the north. They'd charter a plane, go up and hunt for bear. And so they are going up, and the charter pilot tells them, okay, I'll leave you here for a week. Now, shoot only one bear because we don't have room for two. So the pilot comes back in a week, and they've shot two bears. And he said, look, I told you only one. They said, look, there are two bears here. Look, we'll give you a couple of $100 extra. You can get that second bear in. So he does, grumbling a bit. They take off, crash landing. Nobody's seriously injured, but they look around, and one of them says, where are we? And the other said, well, I don't know exactly, but I think it's about where we crashed last year. And I think, as we look back at what's happened, both sides keep making the same mistakes. And what has happened, I would say, since the end of the Cold War, and when by 1992 we thought we had a Europe whole and free. That's what we talked about. And it was sincere, because we had the Warsaw Pact was down, there was peace, there were increasingly democratic governments, at least elected governments across Eastern Europe. Russia itself, in the view of the West, was democratizing, and we had what we thought had been the goal, a Europe whole and free. Well, who were the first to begin to, I would say, act inconsistent with that? The first decision was the decision on the part of the United States and its NATO allies to begin expanding NATO, leaving Russia out. Now, you can't have a Europe whole and free if Russia's not part of it. Complicated going that. Now, what was the Russian reaction to that? At first, with the first expansion to the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, this was accepted. They were disappointed a bit, but not too much reaction. But then, when over the problems in Kosovo, NATO, without UN approval, began bombing Serbia, an act of war, which under UN was illegal because Serbia had not invaded any NATO country. Suddenly, this became a big issue because we had told Russia, look, you don't have to worry. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's incapable of offensive. And suddenly, in attacking Serbia, over humanitarian reasons to be sure, but it was not defensive. So that, I think, in Russian eyes, broke a number of agreements. The Russian reaction to these various things, and as we went into the later into the second Bush administration, the Bush-Cheney administration, we had at first a very good improvement with Russia. Russia was out of their bankruptcy, which occurred in the late 90s, and I must say that as we were beginning expanding to NATO, Russia was going through a period of near chaos. It was not anything like we would consider democracy. Russia has never had democracy, and that's one thing we have to think about, and we have to be a little careful when we speak of Vladimir Putin backtracking on democracy. They haven't had it. They had something very close to anarchy in the 90s. But actually, when Putin came to power, he was able to get the Russian economy back on the upswing, helped greatly, of course, by rising oil prices. But nevertheless, his own administration was much more predictable, much more rational than Yeltsin's had been. But at the same time, even though he was the first to pledge support to the United States after 9/11, and indeed did what he could to assist our invasion of Afghanistan with rights overflight rights, and also with intelligence assistance regarding Afghanistan. Nevertheless, very quickly we withdrew from the ABM Treaty, which had been the basic treaty on which most of our arms control agreements had been. As we continued to expand NATO to the east, we then began to talk about American bases in the Balkans. We began to make plans for missile defenses in Eastern Europe, when on the very implausible ground that you would need them to defend against then non-existent Iranian missiles. Why the Iranians would ever attack Western Europe with missiles was a mystery to some of us. To most of us, it seemed that this was simply an effort of our own military-industrial complex to continue producing these things. Now, each of these things, they were taken for reasons other than to combat Russia or irritate Russia, but it got, I would say, a negative reaction from the Russians. You had something like a vibration that starts. First, it's sort of limited, and then it begins to amplify back and forth. Actions would be taken in the West, and particularly by the United States, that were interpreted to the Russians as being hostile and building up a cordon sanitaire around Russia to bring pressure to bear on it. As I said, that was probably not the intent of most of the people involved, but nevertheless, that's the way it was read. So what you had was a gradually deteriorating relationship made particularly acute when we officially began to interfere more and more in the Russian political process itself. Now, it's one thing to say, we need to spread democracy in the world. I think that for reasons that I don't have time to explain, I don't think that is a great idea. It reminds me of the attempt of the Soviet Union to spread communism in the world, or what they call socialism, particularly when you're doing it by force. Because I don't think outsiders can create democracy for other people. But in any event, the Russians would interpret this as the official American support for the opposition. Now, how does any country, particularly the United States and Americans, react to a foreign country interfering in their domestic affairs? Usually it's to the detriment, almost always, of the person supported. Now, actually, although we ostensibly were trying to help the so-called Democrats, and they were philosophically Democrats, in Russia we were actually hindering them by making them seem as if they were disloyal, seem just the way we would consider communists during the Cold War. Even if they were only philosophically communists and not spies and so on, nevertheless, they must be enemies. So that combination of what the Russian perceives as interference in their internal affairs, plus what they saw as an effort to penetrate and turn against Russia, former republics of the Soviet Union, again, drew very, very negative reactions in Russia. And this was particularly true when you get to Ukraine and Georgia. As far as the three Baltic countries were concerned, I think the Russians were reconciled the fact that they had been a great history in the West. They had been independent, before World War II. They were reluctantly going to accept that they were independent and really part of the West. But what they didn't like was what seemed to be an effort to turn Ukraine, to turn Georgia, even to penetrate militarily into what had been Soviet Central Asia. So these so-called color revolutions, which were genuine revolutions in those countries because they were real abuses, nevertheless, the overt involvement of our own people in them conveyed to the Russians that they were simply tools, you might say, of an American imperialist instinct. So you got what Russians considered provocations. In many cases, what the U.S. was doing was using, I would say, they were following an entirely different philosophy. As a matter of fact, when we look at our current problems, we can see that there really are two, I would say, faulty narratives going on behind our current problems with Russia. The narrative in the West is that we are operating to spread democracy. We are defending the civilized world against terrorism and are spreading democracy for the good of all the people. And that we are, as the sole superpower, it is our responsibility, in effect, to be the world's policeman and also the world's judge and, if necessary, the world's executioner. You know, that really isn't acceptable to Russia. And a lot of this, of course, is based on a misinterpretation of the Cold War. We negotiated an end to the Cold War with Gorbachev, and it was a victory for both sides because it was in the interest of a Soviet Union willing to be peaceful. The Soviet Union came down later, not at the end of the Cold War, but after it was over because of internal pressures. However, when we started talking about we won the Cold War, and implicitly you were defeated in the Cold War, you're not a world power anymore, you're just a regional power. As if the amount of power somehow was correlated with virtue or goodwill or other things. And so much of our policy and our action to the Russians seems to be putting them down, treating them as if they were defeated. On the Russian side, they saw all of this increasingly as an attempt to put them down, an attempt to isolate them from the world, and a refusal to consider their interests in the world whatsoever. So you had this back and forth, escalating in terms of tension. Now, okay, what are we going to do about it? How do we get it on? Now, first of all, I think it is to recognize the process that we have gone through and the fact that we are forgetting that fundamentally the most fundamental interests of the United States and the most fundamental interests of Russia do not conflict. It was really that understanding on which we ended the Cold War. I don't have time to go into detail and precisely how we did it, but essentially we tried to define our ends, that is, the goals we were trying to see, and find ways to cooperate to reach those goals. And when we think about the large problems facing the world today in the security area, terrorism, even more important in the security area, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and the prevention of the nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction from getting in the hands of terrorists. The global warming, an enormous problem for the future if we're not able to cooperate. The spread of disease, it's hardly another month that another one doesn't come up that we're having to work on trying to contain. Just as you seem to have contained Ebola, others come forward, as we're seeing today. These require international efforts, and none of these big problems are going to be solvable without the cooperation of Russia. It's just simply too big. It doesn't have the population it used to have, but it is still a great power in many ways. And when, in their eyes, you put them down, as the president has, when he said, oh, they're only a global power. Now, he was trying to refute ideas that they are, a great threat to us. But the point is, I would say, any country with several thousand ICBMs that could hit us if fired in just a few minutes is not a global power. It's not simply a regional power. Any country that now has the only boosters that can take people to the International Space Station, because we don't have any we're using now, we're using Russian ones, is not simply a regional power. And okay, so they are a regional power. Shouldn't what they do in their own region be respected? So, I would say some of the rhetoric we use when it's read there really takes our attention off what the biggest problems are. Well, and when we worked to end the Cold War, the first thing we did was to try to define what our common interests are, and then to put the differences in perspective. And if you'd say my advice right now, if we are going to deal with this, is to find a way, first of all, to get beyond this conflict of personalities, the demonization of the Russian president. He has followed policies that, in my opinion, are not in Russia's interest, are very damaging to Russia's interest. If I were a Russian, I would certainly not be his supporter. But I'm not a Russian. And he does have overwhelming support in Russia, precisely because they perceive him resisting American pressure and NATO pressure, and precisely because they perceive that we don't respect them, and we don't respect their right to have interests anywhere in the world. We assert our right to intervene anywhere we wish, whether it's legal or not. We're making a very big deal over their actions in Crimea and in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, and there's no question. It's in my mind, we should not legally accept the way they acquired Crimea. But looking behind that issue, we should recognize that we too forcibly changed borders without consent in the case of Kosovo and Serbia, and even recognized Kosovo as legally independent. Under the Helsinki Final Act, we and others in Europe had agreed that you can't change borders without mutual agreement. So we were the first to violate that one. And if you speak of invading another country, as the Russians would say, you invaded Iraq. We told you not to. We told you it was going to be a mess. So did your German allies and your French allies. And what was your reaction? You go ahead and do it anyway. And do you think that was a success? And so, when we are saying what they have done in Ukraine is illegal, it is quite true. But they're saying you don't come into the World Court with clean hands on this one. And let's look at some of the reality. Ukraine's problem is it has been deeply divided ever since it was independence between the West on one hand and the East and South on the other. Deeply divided. And as a matter of fact, many of us think that Ukraine is better off without Crimea, because if the Russians in Crimea had not been voting in the elections, their corrupt president that they threw out in the Maidan Revolution would never have been elected. And the fact is that almost certainly the majority of the people in Crimea did prefer to be in Russia. And the Russians would say, don't you believe in the right of self-determination anymore? Okay, the Russians, they did it illegally. And there's no need for us to accept that. But there's also no real practical reason we should be placing sanctions on them. The effect of those sanctions, I would say, is not great. Their economy is going through great difficulties now, but not primarily because of the sanctions, primarily because of the much lower price of oil. That had been their main income. And their success or failure in the future is going to depend much more on the price of oil. When you do economic sanctions in order to achieve a political effect, it is almost always ineffective. And why is that? Well, go back to the Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, and millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. In other words, if they see this as a challenge to them as a nation and as an attempt to put them down, they're going to do whatever sacrifices it will take. And the Russians are quite accustomed to going by sacrifices. But the political effect is the Russian people will say, our problems are not because of Putin's mistakes, which most of them are. They're because the U.S. and the EU is sanctioning us, and because they are hostile, they are putting us down. So actually, these sanctions work into Putin's advantage at home. And there are other problems with them. So where do we go from here? I would say, frankly, it's going to be extremely difficult for our current presidents, given the fact they have gotten into this personal give and take, for our current president to improve things greatly with Putin. I do think that our Secretary of State is working very hard to settle particularly both the Syrian and the Ukrainian issues, but as far as I can tell, he's not getting tremendous support from the White House. And I would say that such things as President Obama in his State of the Union address, crowing about how we have put Putin's Russia in a difficult economic position, which actually exaggerated the difficulties there. I thought that was totally out of the place in a presidential speech. And then recently, we just had such things as an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury speaking of Putin as corrupt, and then a White House spokesman saying, well, yes, that's our opinion too. Okay, so he's corrupt. Of course he is. How many other leaders are? How often did we talk about Berlusconi or many others in the world being corrupt? I mean, this is a problem for the Russians. In a sense, when you get into that thing, it again conveys to Putin that our only goal is to get rid of him. In other words, to try to undermine his own regime. So again, the attitude is just as if we had under domestic communists later. It's not very helpful. However, having said that, what would it take? Well, first of all, it would take some gestures that would convince Putin that we're not really out to get him, and that's not our aim. And it really means rethinking what are our common interests. The most important one, let's go back to this nuclear issue. And as I said, Russia still has a nuclear arsenal that can wipe us and a lot of others out if it's ever used. And yet, in this development of tensions between the two, almost all of our cooperative efforts have gone by the wayside, including the whole non-Lugar program on nuclear safety. Partly because in some cases, Congress refused to fund some of the aspects, and in other cases, because the Russians closed them down, because in an atmosphere of hostility and collision that we have developed, they are unwilling now for the sort of cooperation that we had for about 20 years in keeping nuclear weapons under control. Now, what are the implications of this? Neither of us want proliferation, and yet under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nuclear weapons powers were obligated to continue to reduce their nuclear weapons stock as part of their contribution to the non-proliferation elsewhere. And I must say, the whole problem of proliferation of dealing with it has stalled now. Clearly, India and Pakistan are not cooperating, and if people worried about Iran going nuclear, I think we have solved that one. I'm much more worried about Pakistan. That is a country which has a history of actually spreading its nuclear capacity, which still is supporting terrorists and the Taliban. They have a growing nuclear arsenal, and who knows, how secure it is. So, there are problems out there that we're simply ignoring in what seems to be, a squabble over, over the geographical and political subordination of parts of Ukraine. That's so. I think we do need to find a way to get back to more cooperation with Russia on nuclear proliferation. Now, unfortunately, when President Obama, I think one of his achievements was the New START agreement, but to get that ratified in the Senate, he had to agree to a very extensive modernization program, which means now the Russians are going through a multi-billion-dollar modernization program. Why? Why? We ended the Cold War first on the basis of an agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev made in their first meeting, which was a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, which means there can be no war between us. And it was that agreement that we ended our direct military confrontations. We talked to each side, and why are we building all these arms? Of course we're not going to have a war. And yet the reaction now is, we've got to put more troops in Eastern Europe. President Obama even has in his budget, which the Senate apparently won't even have hearings on, several $1 billion to build up our forces in Eastern Europe, which, by the way, will contradict an agreement NATO has with Russia, because in the 90s, under the Russian-NATO agreement, we agreed not to have permanent bases in Eastern Europe. Now we say, well, there won't be permanent bases, we'll just rotate people in and out. What's the difference? I mean, as the Russians would say, what's the difference? Now, what's their reaction going to be? If we don't watch it, they're going to break out of the INF treaty. And then what are we going to do? You think we achieve anything by also starting to make these nuclear weapons again? No, it just has no rationality. We need to get back to that. Syria, quite honestly, the Russian position on Syria was a much more rational one than ours. From the beginning of that, they were saying what you need to do is to get all of the parties together and get them to agree on a regime and which will eventually result in an election, which might end with Assad winning or not? Probably not. But you don't start by saying Assad has to go before anything happens. And they were saying, that doesn't make any sense. Didn't you learn anything by taking out Saddam Hussein and then taking out Gaddafi? Each time you've ended up with something worse. You want that in Syria? Syria is awfully close to us. And I'll tell you one thing, they are much more vulnerable to Islamic terrorism than we are. Look at the map and also look at the nationalities they have. And they have very legitimate interests in Syria, I would say more legitimate than ours. And yet we've been acting as if they have none at all. And if they don't go along with us, they're a problem. Actually, right now, I think, despite the perception in a lot of our media, I really think Secretary Kerry is trying to work that one out. Because, in fact, we have more interest in cooperating with Russia and Iran than we do in cooperating with Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who actually have created much of the problem there. So this is one of the issues that I think in this case, if we can, we should be able rationally to get a more cooperative policy out of Russia. And in doing it, but it's going to require some change in our attitude. In the case of Ukraine, here again, I think that there is a way out. One thing would be a recognition by, maybe it has to be Chancellor Merkel in Germany. It could be our president, but I don't think our current president will do it, is simply to say, look, let's go back to square one. Let's recognize that Ukraine can never be a successful country without good relations with Russia. Let's tell the Ukrainians, look, you have really got to make a deal with Russia. We'll help you get the best you can, but it's got to be a deal, and you must go into a federated system the way they do. It makes no sense to have the sort of centralized government they have. And, of course, their legislature is resisting that change in their constitution. So the word to Russia must be that let's go back to square one and negotiate a way that Russia and Ukraine can interact economically with the EU to gradually improve the economy of all of them. But part of that has to be that NATO will not consider a Ukrainian or a Georgian membership. That is an absolute red line, which Russia has been signaling now for more than 10 years. And why we can't give that assurance, because the reaction, if we don't give that assurance, then we're not going to get any settlement there, because Russia will not allow the United States to come in and gain control of its principal naval base on the Black Sea, which is in Crimea. I'm convinced that without the perceived threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine, Putin would never have even taken Crimea. Now that they have, we don't have to recognize it legally, but again, we need to put it on the back burner and advise both sides. Look, if the Ukrainians and the Russians will agree that in 3 years, 5 years, some fairly short period of time, there will be another referendum, and that both sides will abide by them, I think that is a legal way out, and that's what we should be advising. Simply beating up on the Russians and sanctioning them is not going to bring any good result. Now, so basically, we need an effort to go back to where our interests lie and convey this openly and then privately about what sort of deals we can do. In the final analysis, 50 years from now, it is not going to make one difference to the world whether Crimea is in Russia or Ukraine, or even whether Ukraine is a single state, or maybe 2 or 3. It's important to the people there what happens to their lives, but not to the rest of us. What happens on the nuclear front? What happens with global warming? What happens in dealing with organized crime? All of these international issues, that is going to be vital in 50 years. And to get distracted by these disputes over, you might say, control of territory, I think has been a great problem and is actually a threat, because in the final analysis, whoever the leader of Russia is either going to be part of the problem or part of the solution to the big questions that face us. And I think we need to find a policy to make them part of the solution. Thank you very much. Yes.
I wonder if you could just say one word. What are Russia's relationship with China? How are they handling that?
Russia's relationship with China. They're handling that very well. Of course, in fact, increasingly, there has been a movement to try to create with China, India, Brazil, the so-called BRIC nations, a sort of an economic organization that would, to some degree, compete with the one that the United States dominates. Now, so their relations with China are very good, but the problem is that now that the Chinese economy is slowing down, and particularly that energy prices are down, China had just a couple of years ago signed a very large agreement to supply natural gas from Russia. Whether there will be the capital to do this at current prices remains to be seen. And they have plans which may or may not be financed, given China's economic difficulties, for new routes of what they call the New Silk Road, with both land and other routes tying China through Central Asia into Europe and through Russia. So definitely there has been a tendency in Russia to try to use the relationship with China to find some alternatives, particularly economic alternatives. But basically the Chinese have played this brilliantly. I think they have gotten, they haven't put a lot of money in it. They haven't recognized Russia's take in Crimea, but they haven't beat up on them about it. And they just go ahead and do their business and are doing it very successfully. Actually, I think good relations between Russia and China are in our interests. I don't look at that as competitive. Good heavens, we don't gain anything if there's tension between them. So I don't see this as threatening to the United States, but certainly the more difficulty Russia has in dealing with us gives them more incentive to try to find common cause on as many issues as they can with the Chinese. And I'd say the same is true with India, Brazil, and some of the other larger developing countries.
It seems to me that often the president of each country is boxed in by right-wing nationalists in that president's country, and that force dictates often our relations with Russia and Russia's relationship with the U.S. If we're to move in the direction you're recommending, how do our presidents in each country handle the right-wing nationalism?
That is a very good question and a very difficult one. I don't think there's a simple answer. You really have to look at each of the disputes. It's one of the reasons we're hearing now we need to build up our presence in Eastern Europe, because Russia might attack the Baltic states. I don't think there is the faintest prospect of Russia attacking the Baltic states. Why would they? The Russians in Estonia don't want to be in Russia, or they would have gone to Russia. They're better off in Estonia. And yes, they have some grievances because the Estonians haven't given them the full rights of citizenship. But you know, but I think that's going to be worked out. That doesn't mean, and why would Russia start taking up this territory? Now, eastern Ukraine, each of these situations, I would say, is sui generis in the sense that they have unique aspects. In the case of Georgia, one says, well, the Russian war against Georgia. What Russia did to Georgia was exactly what we did to Serbia over Kosovo, because Georgia had gone through toward its enclaves the same way the Serbs had, except when it was Serbia against Kosovo, we took Kosovo's side. When it was Georgia against the South Ossetians and the Abkhazians, we took the Georgian side. So something else the Russians haven't noticed. But the fact was that Georgia had started that war earlier. They were already going against South Ossetia while the Soviet Union was still there. And that's why George Herbert Walker Bush, when he spoke in Ukraine, August 1st, 1991, advising the Ukrainians and the other non-Baltic republics to stay with Gorbachev in a voluntary union treaty. He warned against suicidal nationalism. He was thinking about Georgia then. And he also said, don't confuse independence with freedom. Choose freedom. And in fact, of course, that didn't happen. And most of the republics, aside from the three Baltic republics, ended up less free after the Soviet Union broke up than it was in the last year of the Soviet Union. You know, when one looks at these details, and in the case of Russia, what Putin is saying is the breakup of the Soviet Union, which although we had nothing, we were trying to help Gorbachev keep the Soviet Union together as a voluntary federation. That failed, but given all the rhetoric about winning the Cold War and so on, most Russians assumed that we broke up the Soviet Union. And therefore, that this has all been a conspiracy against Russia. And the point Putin makes when he said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, then what he had in mind, he has said since, is because it left so many Russians outside their country. After all, there were Russians in all of the other republics of the Soviet Union. And Russia would say, look, everybody has had the right of self-determination except Russians. Look at Crimea. They never asked Crimea, do you want to be part of Ukraine or do you want to be part of Russia? They just said, that's where the border is. And those borders had been set, most of them, back in the 20s by Stalin, precisely to divide people so they could be dominated by Moscow. So, you know, when you delve into the history of many of these issues, there is a lot of ambiguity. And yes, Putin has certainly been utilizing this feeling that the Russians have been the put-upon nationality in Europe, been put down. They cooperated to end the Cold War. They virtually destroyed their military might, and then they were treated as defeated and with no rights whatsoever. Therefore, what do? We better build our military back up. We better start pushing back. This is the way they see it. Now, you know, their military actions in the Baltic and so on, I think, are utterly stupid. But the fact is, I don't think they're doing anything that NATO hasn't been doing all along, which is flying surveillance around the borders. We do it with China. We've done it with them. We just continued a lot of those Cold War things. And I think, you know, I think they're unnecessary for our security, and they're bringing this blowback, which is not good for Russia or for us. Yeah, but, you know, I'm certainly not a partisan of Donald Trump for president, but I think that what he said actually lies behind it precisely what we need to get along with him. As a matter of fact, as I've said to several people, I hate to say it, but on one issue, that is dealing with Russia, Trump is probably better than any of the other candidates now. The only other one, you know, was the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. He's out of the race now. In effect, he said, you know, he's a successful leader of his country, have a little respect for him. And again, he's the sort of guy that, you go to him in private and say, okay, Vlad, what's the deal? You know, I'm not going to interfere in Ukraine. Why the hell should I? Now let's get together in Syria. And by the way, we got to give more attention to these nuclear weapons, or else we're going to have a lot of non-proliferation. Now let's get these agreements going back. That would work, I think, with Vladimir Putin. But a president who is constantly putting him down publicly is not going to. In fact, he's going to even make him stronger at home, which is precisely what a lot of the Obama criticism has done.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.